So welcome to this plenary. After a long day, a final closure with an exciting lineup of speakers. The topic is dialogues between critical social theory, science, and degrowth. As you know, since you are in this conference, degrowth is our work, our research and activism on degrowth is a very interdisciplinary and very pluralistic field of work. Some people, because of the term degrowth, misrepresent it or misunderstand it as something that has to do with economics, no? Because economics studies growth. But degrowth is not an economic theory, it's not just a critique of economics, it's not something that's taking place within economics. But from the beginning, it has been in the confluence of many different lines of thought, from natural science, critical social science, political theorists, anthropologists, geographers, people who are interdisciplinary themselves, but also people who collaborate, in the disciplinary people collaborating among themselves. I call this interdisciplinary, so it's interdisciplinary twice now. We haven't reflected on that interdisciplinarity up to now in the previous conferences, and I think it's an excellent idea of the organizers to open up also this debate. How do we bring together, or how does each one of us in their own work, research, or even in their own activism, combine these different fields of knowledge? In particular here, we're focusing on the combination of natural science on the one hand and critical social science, because they are both necessary if we are to make sense of our current predicament. We need to understand both, for example, how the climate system is working, how the global environmental system is working, how energy systems work, but at the same time, we need to understand how we work, how societies work, no? How political systems change. My name is Giorgos Kallis. I'm an ecological economist and political ecologist based at ICTA at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And we have today four excellent speakers who are going to reflect on the interdisciplinarity, or how they combine, or how they grapple with this combination of natural science and critical social science in their own work. We're going to start with Stefania Barca from the Center of Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. Stefania is an environmental historian. Then we're going to have Andreas Malm from the University of Lund, human ecologist. Ruth Kinna, a political theorist from Loughborough University, and Nicholas Ashford, working on law and the environment at MIT. So all four of them, I think you understand already from the short descriptions, are crossing and transcending these disciplinary boundaries that other communities are more used to. So they're gonna have each 15 minutes, and after that we're gonna open it to the audience to continue the discussion. So we start with Stefania.
I think, is it on? Yes. Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizing for putting this panel together. Let me go straight to it. I am, as Giorgos said, I'm an environmental historian. I've been practicing this field of research for the past 20 years, but in a very undisciplined way, which means using theoretical perspectives from a variety of other fields, especially political ecology and ecological economics, and more recently from the environmental humanities. But let me tell you, what is environmental history? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this field. There are many possible ways, of course, of defining it, but I will just point out two let's say, two things that are key to the environmental historian's work. First of all, pay attention to what happens in the web of life. We are historians, and historians normally don't do that. They don't pay attention to non-human nature. So pay attention to what happens to the soil, to the air, to the water cycle, to non-human life, from the microorganisms to big fauna. And why? Because we humans, we are enmeshed with it. And our history, so what we do and who we are, cannot be understood without considering the web of life. This approach is common to other social science disciplines, such as human ecology, for example. You will hear about it from Andreas Malm later. Second point is understanding environmental change over time. This is what we do, historians. We understand change and continuity over time. And so identifying and explaining change, but also continuity or recurrence. For example, climate fluctuations like the El Niño and La Niña phenomena, for example. No? So distinguishing what is new and unprecedented within each historical process and identifying the possible causes. Of course, this is a very reductive understanding of what environmental history is, but I think these are the 2 points that are most matter. That said, environmental historians differ profoundly as to how they make sense of this environmental change and continuity, depending on the theoretical perspective that they use. In my case, I will tell you, I have come to a perspective that I would call an ecofeminist historical materialism. Then this is a vision of environmental change as related to social struggles, but social struggles that encompass class, gender, and colonial dimensions, and also species, interspecies relations. Infraspecies relations. My point of departure is a theoretical approach that was developed in the late 80s by environmental historian and historian of science, Caroline Merchant. And this approach was called this perspective was called the ecological revolution, and incorporated both Marxist and feminist critiques of science. So in this paradigm, environmental change is produced by capitalism's ecological contradictions, between production, reproduction, and ecology. In this model, non-human nature is an actor. Is not passive. Those contradictions are both generated by and generate forms of ecological consciousness that can be hegemonic or alternative. For example, modern science. Merchant is very famous for her book, The Death of Nature, that was about the scientific revolution in the 17th century. Modern science is seen as a contested terrain, something that emerged out of struggle. For example, the witch hunt. Also, Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, tells the same story. But also environmentalism as a form of scientific understanding of nature is a contested terrain. There are different ways of understanding nature that come from there. Different, I mean, from hegemonic modern science. So consciousness can be also social struggles in social movements. For example, the movements for women's emancipation and reproductive rights have changed reproductive patterns, or environmental movements have changed the way environmental costs, for example, pollution, are regulated. So consciousness is very much part of this interaction between production, reproduction, and ecology. Her study was on a regional, had a regional dimension, was about New England, and she looked at environmental change in New England starting from the 16th century until the 20th. And she identified 2 ecological revolutions. Both were induced by the expansion of Western capitalism into the New World, and both took place via the extermination of indigenous modes of production, reproduction, and ecologies, and of indigenous peoples themselves. So the first was the colonial ecological revolution, and this meant the end of the world for indigenous people, the collapse of their world. And the second was the industrial ecological revolution that happened in the more or less along the 19th century, and this signified the end of the patriarchal, self-sufficient world of localized subsistence farming. I won't go into the details, but I can tell you more if you're interested in the debate. So what does it mean to apply this approach to our current epoch, the epoch of planetary, global, Earth system changes? And what do we gain from seeing this epoch as an ecological revolution on the world scale, on planetary scale? First of all, it becomes clear that this is not the first time the world ends for someone. People, species, ecosystems, epistemes, as a result of someone else's systemic actions. What is happening today with catastrophic climate and Earth system changes leading to a new great extinction, mass displacements of people and destruction of livelihoods, this should be set against the grain of that longer history of hegemony of Western capitalist patriarchy, leading to genocide, ecocide, and epistemicide on the global scale. However, the historical data we have from both historians and from natural scientists tell us very clearly that there has been a sudden and exponential increase in ecological collapse, which has coincided with exponential increase in land use changes associated with the past 6 decades, the era of growth, what is now called the Great Acceleration. What is unprecedented is the scale of change in this epoch, starting from the 1950s. The scale of change, which is not now systemic and at the planetary level. Environmental change has always occurred, as always, humans have always changed and modified their environments, but that usually happened on more local scales, even though, of course, from the 17th century, from the 16th century onwards, also planetary changes have been occurring due to colonization, the European colonization of the world. And what is unprecedented is the scale of life extinction that is associated with that, and the number of people that are already affected, and the many more that will be, increasing exponentially the mass killing perpetuated by the few upon the many. So, what happens if we look at the Great Acceleration as an ecological revolution? First of all, we look at production, and the data we have show us an exponential increase in global GDP and other indicators, but of course global GDP is very significant since 1950. And this was mostly linked to industrial production and globalization of trade. Then, in the past decades, there has been also the digitalization, the rise of cognitive capitalism, the financialization, and etc. So, looking at production is a very key point in understanding the ecological revolution, because all these things have to do with the use of nature, of non-human nature, because all these have a material basis, new extractive frontiers of rare earth materials, increasing demand for energy sources, etc. But the point is, the changes in commodity production associated with the era of growth have had major effects onto the web of life, including, but not limited to, human life and social reproduction. So, what happens in reproduction? The human population has skyrocketed from 2 billions to 7 billions starting from in the second half of the 20th century. And this despite hunger, widespread hunger and poverty, AIDS, etc. So how do we explain that? The current explanation in mainstream economics and in mainstream narratives also, mainstream economic history, for example, is that is thanks to growth. It's thanks to economic growth and the convergence. But was it rather the penicillin? Was it rather DDT, for example, that exterminated malaria in many areas, even though, of course, with other costs? Or was it as in feminist social reproduction theory, and I'm thinking here of Silvia Federici's work, for example, can we hypothesize that it was rather poverty the reason why this world population increase, in the sense that the process of unlimited primitive accumulation that is associated with the globalization of economic growth has led to proletarianization, the transformation of the people into proletarians on the world scale. So and so the production of cheap labor, as Jason Moore would also say, production of cheap labor on the world scale to feed into the machine of growth, and the oppression of women, of course. We also need to look at new disease patterns, the spreading of pollution-related diseases not only in industrialized countries, but also in the poor countries where industrial waste is displaced. This is something new, unprecedented in our era. Or also in the sacrificed zones of the industrial countries as well. The return of viruses that were thought of as defeated, the mass migrations, the feminization of waged work, there are many things that concern the sphere of reproduction and that we need to look at if we want to understand this epoch. But then we should look at the third sphere, the sphere of ecology, climate and earth system changes. We are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction of non-human species. And then the long list of things that you have already heard, many things: global warming, acidification of oceans, soil erosions, water crisis, nuclear fallout, etc. So environmental change is not new. What is unprecedented is the fact that economic growth for a small fraction of the human population is responsible for irreversible planetary changes that affect the rest of the human species and all other species. So economic growth could be seen as the core element of the social system that is driving the current ecological revolution. In this perspective, degrowth would become part of the community of those forces, global forces, that are resisting, opposing, countering this process, while also planting seeds for an alternative system that would not only prevent the end of the world, but change the world, changing the system. But the ecological revolution perspective also tells us that this is not the first time in history that people have resisted catastrophic environmental change, acting from the ground up. In fact, the world we live in has also been positively shaped by those people who have put their bodies in the midst of the current of economic growth and opposed it. So the point is, how can we, people in this room, scholars, activists, intellectuals, whatever you like to define yourselves, how can we contribute towards making sure that this time we win? And especially, what do we mean by that? I think that to answer those questions, we need to disclaim our standpoint. There is no such thing as objective knowledge. All knowledge is embodied and situated in class, racial, gender, and species relations. Science is and must be plural. So this does not mean adopting a relativist approach that considers all knowledge equally legitimate, but to make explicit what our perspective and priorities are when it comes to make science, to do research. For example, in researching the Anthropocene history, we need to make explicit if our research is guided by the perspective of survival of the species and maintenance of the status quo, as many scholars do, including the maintenance of the growth paradigm, or by a critique of the status quo, a critical social science perspective. So the idea I have been working on recently and that I want to put forth here tonight to gather your feedback is that of working towards degrowing science. Climate change has spurred the growth of big universal science. There is much talking of building an integrated science of global change, which translates into recurrent talks to build bigger and more global research programs, needing more money, and also, it must be noted, producing bigger career advancements for fewer people, the hyper-selected 1% of global research, you could call it, mostly white males. The idea that some new kind, as it's proven by the gender composition of the Anthropocene Working Group, the group of scientists who are studying this epoch from a geological perspective, which is 99% white males. So the idea that some new kind of enlightened big science will save the world is a very persistent Western myth, one which lays on all sides of the political spectrum. For example, in a 500 pages long co-authored volume called The System's View of Life, Frigio Capra and Luigi Luisi put forward the grand idea that science has finally entered a new stage that makes it possible and indeed necessary to think in systemic terms, if only the world politicians adopted this view of life, all humanity's problems would be solved. Not only does the system's view of life magically dissolve social conflicts, colonial relations, power asymmetries of all sorts, but it offers rational solutions to social problems based on mimicking natural systems, solutions that can only be imagined and designed, guess what, by enlightened natural scientists, the scientific minds. Okay, so I will cut short on this. I think I gave you the sense of my critique, right? There is no mention in the system view of life to the violence that has given birth and sustained modern Western science thus far, no space for a plural dialogue among different ways of knowing and acting life. Systemic knowledge is a matter of big, complex, and costly science, carried out in research institutions and disseminated via educational programs and books, in the hope that it can reach politicians and translate into policies. So, okay. This critique also applies to the critical social sciences. For example, by proposing to integrate critical social science and humanities into a global change science together with the natural and hard sciences. Noel Castries, in a recent article published on the Anthropocene Review, falls prey to the same hubris of aiming to total knowledge to be achieved via a truly all-inclusive science package. But another example I want to make that concerns more historians and human humanities scholars is the debate over the name of the thing, the name of this epoch. Since ever the Anthropocene term had appeared, scholars have engaged in intellectual debates over the possible alternatives to the name Anthropocene. And rightly so, because Anthropocene is a terrible choice. I'm not arguing that this debate was meaningless, and to show how sincere I am, I will also engage with it and propose my own definition, one that has not been yet proposed as far as I know, and that sounds pretty much obvious to me, the West-ocene, the age of Western hegemony. Let me also say that the point is not in finding the right name for it, or as I'm winning the battle of ideas. In fact, all other geological epochs have been named after material sediments found in geological strata, not after the supposed cause of epoch changing, which is an intellectual pretense indicative, to my view, of a mastering attitude towards knowledge, the aim of defining the one most important factor that explains it all. The truth is that there are many aspects which can explain the mess we are in, and choosing one over another is a political act. For example, choosing capital over humanity is a great move, indeed very important, towards clarifying things. But capital is definitely not the only explanation for climate change, for the simple reason that non-capitalist economies, such as the Soviet bloc, for example, have concurred in very important ways with their own race to economic growth. Even if capitalism is now commonly understood as a historical system of domination based on multiple oppressions of class, of gender, colonial, etc., naming our age the capital scene could make one think that class oppression was the only thing that matters, while other oppressions were secondary. The term growth-ocene has also been proposed by Giorgos and Paulson, and should also enter the picture of what this epoch is about. Or my favorite one is the white manthropocene, proposed by Kate Raworth and Giovanna Di Ciro. So which one would you choose? How important is for us to choose? Think hard, because naming is a political act with political consequences. And I will stop here.
The next speaker is Andreas Malm.
All right. This is such a great event. It's pretty amazing to see all of you here. I live just around the corner, and I'm one of those local patriots that spoke, similar to those that spoke on the first day, that use this space, Folkets Park, as a living room. Go here almost every day with my daughter. And all of a sudden, we have those hundreds of wonderful, beautiful comrades. Not that people are not wonderful and beautiful in your absence, but it adds an extra dimension, and it's really nice to have you all in what I consider my own backyard. Now, I had prepared for just a little talk based on the questions that we received from the organizers, and now I'm hearing that we're basically free to say whatever we want, and if I had known that, I would have prepared something different based largely on what's been going on in Sweden in terms of the weather of the past months. I think I will have to improvise a little bit, but I'll start by saying, responding to at least some of the questions that were sent to us by the organizers of this particular session. And those questions prompted me to engage with degrowth, which I have to admit I haven't done very much. I'm a real history nerd, so I've spent the better part of the last half year researching climate change in ancient Egypt, and I ask you for forgiveness for spending so much of the precious little time we have on such a peripheral and distant topic when I could have, for instance, read degrowth literature instead. I mean, I've read a bit. I've read Prosperity Without Growth and some of that stuff, and I find it generally very compelling. To at least catch up a little bit, picked a recent essay by Comrade Giorgos here, the one in CNS called Socialism Without Growth, to at least engage with some of the core ideas. And again, I find it a compelling read and a very persuasive argument. And I'm going to say just a few more things about how I perceive the arguments in this particular article and generally about degrowth. But let me just first say that I'm very proud that many of my own students in human ecology at Lund University have organized this event. And that's not because I have taught them degrowth, because I certainly haven't. It's because they themselves have discovered and developed and been attracted to the degrowth paradigm and the degrowth movement. And I think that's indicative of the momentum that this project has developed over the past years as what is probably now the central project at the interface between academic research in the field of environmental studies and environmental activism in this part of the world. And it's quite clear to me that the degrowth movement has revived in a very important way the environmental movement and ecological thinking, I guess particularly in Europe, and that it has achieved a quite remarkable feat in rekindling the utopian imagination while at the same time stressing as its core tenet the limitations to human metabolism, in the sense that there are actual biophysical limits within which we have to live, and we have to decrease total throughput to respect those limits, but using this not to just articulate general doom and gloom, but to also prod thinking about what constitutes the good life and all of these things, and make people think again about how we can live more rewarding lives than at present within those limits. And I find that to be, as I said, very impressive. And I think you, for instance, you're spot on when you write, Giorgos here, I'll be addressing you on the basis of this piece for a little bit, when you write that the response to Malthusianism should not be that humans are infinitely ingenious and know no limits, but that they can collectively limit themselves to a fair and sustainable share. And I think that this argument is also very important in debates on the left at this present conjuncture, because there is, to my mind, quite disturbingly, a resurgence of some of the more Promethean, ultra-techno-optimist thinkings in the left, and I'm thinking in particular of the fad called fully automated luxury communism, which is quite popular in the Anglophone left, particularly in the UK, perhaps mostly. And the advocates of fully automated luxury communism, I think, fall prey to the idea that there are no limits, and that is the proper response to Malthusianism and general right-wing reaction to advocate a communist future where we have basically transcended all kinds of biophysical limits on the basis of renewable energy as they see it. And I believe that it's crucially important to, as degrowthers seem to be doing, insist on the non-negotiability of certain biophysical limits, and that there is no realistic way that we can just transcend those limits, however communist, however perfect and utopian our communism might potentially become one day. All of this said, and this is all in fundamental agreement with what I understand to be the Degrowth project, and as I repeat, my knowledge is superficial, so I might have understood some basics. Please correct me if I have so. Having said all this, I think I'll say a few words about this summer. Or let me start by saying that the climate emergency is not in the future, it's upon us. And this is abundantly clear. And this, to me, is the overarching issue that should determine our political agenda. And I have to say that I become more and more a single issue academic and activist for every year, in the sense that I really think that climate change surpasses everything else. And I'm fully aware of the sixth mass extinction, the plastics in the ocean, and I mean all of the other problems that we have. Occupation of Palestine, whatever. But I think that there is something very, very special about runaway climate change as we are currently experiencing it in its very first phases. And how do we deal with this? Well, there was a paper recently put out by Johan Rockström and those people, not the one that everyone's been talking about this summer in PNAS, but one in Science, where they laid out a roadmap for rapid decarbonization on a global scale, where Rockström and his co-authors argue that we need to have a global carbon law that mandates a halving of emissions every decade on all scales in all countries, spanning all sectors of the world economy. And they argue that the UNFCCC should operate as what they call a vanguard forum, that's the term they use, for designing a plan and making sure it's implemented. And I believe that if we are going to stand any chance avoiding a completely irreversible and uncontrollable climate breakdown, something along these lines is needed. And it's so late in the day, so much has already been emitted, that I'm not even sure that we can any longer speak of a window of opportunity for avoiding 1.5 degrees of climate change, or even 2 degrees of climate change. When I read the papers from the front line of climate science, I get the feeling and impression that it's exceedingly difficult to stay within those limits, because business as usual has pushed us to a point where it seems almost impossible. And this means that we need to engage with the whole discussion around geoengineering and negative emissions on a very serious basis. Now, no scheme for geoengineering, be it carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management, can substitute for slashing emissions. And proponents, serious proponents of those schemes know that very well. So there isn't really any way around a very swift, all-encompassing, deep, radical decarbonization of the entire world economy. And here is where I come to my little disagreement, and it's perhaps a difference in emphasis more than a serious disagreement, but at least there's something. When I read, for instance, this article on degrowth. And I believe that at this particular conjuncture in history, the key metric or measure shouldn't be total throughput, but it should be emissions of greenhouse gases. And those need to be, as I said, done away with, and we need to move towards negative emissions to pull the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down. And this means, and here I tend to agree with what some of the speakers on the previous panel in this room said, this means that some throughput will have to be increased. And increase is perhaps the right word, as you point out in this article, not growth in the sense of compound growth that goes on forever, 3% every year. But you will have to have massive increase of some types of materials extraction and production and construction. Just consider this country that we're in. I'm in favor of immediately shutting down all domestic flights in this country. That's one obvious step towards a zero emissions Swedish economy. Now, if we're going to do that, we're going to have to replace the flights that people use to travel to Luleå and Umeå and Kinna and other parts in northern Sweden with a massive rollout of new railway capacity. And that means building new things, extracting new materials, and having an increase of throughput in that particular section of the economy. And generally, if you're going to move the world economy towards negative total aggregate emissions within a couple of decades, I don't see how we can achieve that without massively increasing biophysical throughput in the alternative sectors. So, for instance, Giorgos here writes on page 5 of this article, true, the use of one resource can be reduced in absolute terms if substituted by another, but this merely shifts pressure from one resource to another, substituting one environmental problem with another, e.g. reducing the use of fossil fuels but increasing the use of nuclear power or the land occupied by renewable sources, etc. So if I understand the argument correct here, it is that, okay, if you shift pressure from one resource to another, you haven't really made any serious gain because the total biophysical throughput is still equally large. But to me, this is a bit of an analytical mistake, because I believe that if we actually shifted the throughput from fossil fuels to land, we would have made a very massive gain, namely radically decreasing the likelihood of absolutely catastrophic climate change. Now, I do not argue, and I do not believe that renewable energy comes with no harm, no damage, no disadvantages to ecosystems. And I don't think any serious advocate of renewable energy believe this, at least they shouldn't believe this. But I think there is a qualitative difference between environmental impact by fossil fuel combustion and renewable energy expansion. It's a little bit like comparing genocide with shoplifting to me. Both are crimes in a sense, but they're still completely different categories. Okay, I have to round up now. I didn't even get to the summer. Just let me finish by saying very quickly that climate emergency is upon us, and it's been abundantly clear in this country. And the dimension of the disaster this summer has, I think, taken every Swede, or at least most Swedes who care about those things, by surprise, by shock. The level of crisis in our agricultural sector is just astounding. Now, all of this makes me feel, and I'm going to wind up here, all of this feeling of climate emergency being upon us makes me feel that we should assert what some activists in the early 1970s used to call the primacy of action. Now, I was at the first COP meeting in Berlin in 1995, and we were a couple of hundred activists who formed a human blockade around the conference venue on the final day to prevent the negotiators, all the ministers, from leaving, and we chanted, "No more blah, 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 action now." That was in 1995. Since then, global greenhouse gas emissions have increased on an annual level so that they are now about 50% larger than they were in 1995. But I'm beginning to feel that we should turn the chant towards ourselves. It's time for us to assert the primacy of action, and some of you may know who I'm paraphrasing here. I think it's time to go from protest to resistance. From protest in the sense of saying we don't want emissions, to resistance in the sense of physically intervening in emissions and trying to shut them down. And next week, we have this year's Ende Gelände type action coming up in the Netherlands. I would encourage as many of you as can, logistically, to go there, because we're going to physically, non-violently, shut down the extraction of natural gas around Gröningen. And these are the types of actions that need to be conducted on a massive scale. And it behooves us as environmental academics to go out of the academic bubble and join real direct actions now. Okay.
Ruth Kinna is the next speaker. I would please ask the two speakers to keep it absolutely maximum 15 minutes, because we are running out of time for discussion, which I think will be a pity given the quality of the contributions.
I've got to plug something in.
Yeah.
Sure what.
No, you don't have to plug anything. Just turn it on.
No, this has to plug in somewhere.
Why? It's not there now. Don't worry. Your talk is this one. Can you hold this for me?
People could move to sit in the middle, then these people who are sitting on the outside might be able to get in, because there's a lot of seats empty in the middle. Just move right on over.
Oh, that's the one. Thanks so much.
It's not showing up in the screen. Ah, yeah, okay, now it's fine. Okay, please take a seat because we don't want to lose more time. Thanks.
How do I get the full screen? Is it just there? Ah, fantastic. And then that moves it along?
Yeah, just from here. Don't worry about that.
Okay, fantastic.
Please start.
Okay. I'd like to thank the organisers for extending the invitation to me. So I've set up this this presentation as an attempt to show what I think is the affinity between anarchism and degrowth. So, like the previous speaker, I'm not someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about degrowth, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about anarchism. And what I want to do in the presentation is to address the three questions that I was asked to think about by the organisers. And they are, how do anarchist theoretical perspectives connect to degrowth? What commonalities and contradictions can be identified between them? And how can they be mutually enriching? So what I'm going to do in the presentation is answer the first question by saying the way that anarchist theoretical perspectives connect to degrowth is through a critique of domination and slavery, and I've got the most to say about that in the presentation. The commonalities and contradictions within anarchism I'll touch on when I talk about the tensions, as I see it, between anti-civilization critique and modernisation. And then right at the end of the presentation, I've got a slide which talks about anarchist education, which is actually about the ways in which anarchists understand the generation of knowledge, or what we might call plural science. So, to start off, the theoretical perspectives. So, my starting point really is this idea that anarchists are critics of domination and slavery, and the anarchist thesis is that comes directly to look at the idea of growth rather than degrowth. So that's where the connection lies. And the anarchist critique suggests that the idea of limitless growth is a function of state domination and capitalist exploitation. Well, how does this work? There are two ways in which we can understand this relationship. The first is in a sort of legalistic way. So the constitutional guarantee to the right to private property, this is Proudhon's starting point, facilitates capitalist exploitation. Okay, and at the same time, the legal protection that capitalists get to exploit depends on the monopoly of force that capitalism finances. So there's a symbiotic relationship between capitalism and the state, and that's the context within which the anarchist understands growth to operate. So to illustrate this, there's a little diagram which is supposed to capture the essence of a sort of an anarchist historical sociology of the state. So if we start with the claim to sovereignty, the theoretical claim to sovereignty, that there will be a sovereign in a particular area. This is not just a conceptual claim, although it is a very important conceptual claim. It's also a claim that involves territorialization and bordering, okay? In order to be the sovereign, in order to be the lawmaker, in order to be the person who decides what goes in a particular area, you need military force. And classically, the modern states are grounded on the use of military force to drive out all comers to challenge the sovereign. If you're going to raise an army and you're going to assert your claim of sovereignty within a particular territorial boundary, you need to pay that army, you need credit. And this is where the capitalist relationship comes in, and the anarchist argues that fundamentally the modern state is based on the credit lines that banks and single individuals in some cases extend in order for sovereigns to enforce their power within a particular territory. What happens once that claim to sovereignty has been established, once that monopoly has been established, is that you have a system of taxation set up, and that system of taxation is the system through which exploitation occurs. You need to pay back the creditor, and therefore you allow people to exploit workforces in order that they pay taxes that can then be dished out to various sort of better off interests, if you like. Now, the last part of the diagram, the constitutional order, this is fluid. So you can have more or less libertarian states, more or less social democratic states, more or less authoritarian states, depending on the nature of the balance of power within any particular geographical location. But the anarchist will argue, although you will have important differences within those territorial boundaries, and some citizens will be an awful lot better off than other citizens in other territories, the problem of growth, the problem of limitless growth, is explained by this nexus between the political elite, if you like, the person who wants, or the group of people who want to establish sovereign control, and the people who finance that control. Okay, Why do I think that there's a particular affinity between anarchism and degrowth? To try and demonstrate this, sorry, it's a bit of a busy slide, but to try and demonstrate this, what I've done on the left-hand side is to list 3 sort of standard claims of non-anarchist socialist movements. The first is that the state is a historic achievement. The second is that capitalism provides the preconditions for socialism because it provides the abundance through which we can realise distribution according to need. And that socialism can be defined, at least at a minimum, at a basic, as a principle of redistribution on the basis of need and the reduction of the working day. Okay, so in Marx's terms, you move from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. Okay, now the anarchist critique, because there is this sort of understanding of the way in which the state works with capital, is slightly different. The anarchist critique says the state is historically contingent. It is a system of domination. It's a system of domination that not only dominates other human beings, it dominates the whole of all of the global species. It's characterized by monopoly, it's characterized by centralization and the principle of command. There is no tipping point within capitalism where we're ever in a position where we can move from capitalism to socialism, because capitalism is incredibly flexible, it's incredibly fluid. There's no one era or one time, one moment where we can say, yeah, we've produced enough now that we can actually just feed everybody, clothe everybody, give everybody a modicum of luxury, and we can do this on the basis of a different kind of system of production. The anarchist says, no, there's always going to be competition within a state system. There's always going to be a drive for profit and for growth and for reinvestment and for more growth. There will be no end to this, and capital and the state will find a way in order to perpetuate this relationship. So what do we need to do? What are the implications of this? Well, the first one is that we have to abolish the state. Well, what does that mean? It means that we have to find new ethical relationships with each other, and we have to do that by reorganizing. We have to reorganize from the bottom up, the anarchist says. We have to find ways in which we can live in more closely knit communities, where we can spend different kinds of time with each other, where we can make real decisions that affect each other's lives with each other, where we can enjoy solidarity, mutuality, reciprocity. We cannot do that within the existing framework of the state. We have to change fundamentally the way in which we organise, the way in which we constitutionalise, the way in which we make decisions. In order to do that, we also have to communalise our property. We cannot have a guaranteed right to private property, because for as long as we do that, we are structuring inequality and domination into our systems. And that means, as I say, not just domination of one lot of humans to another, but the domination of humans to the earth, to non-human species. So socialist transformation from the anarchist point of view is not just changing the structure of ownership or the getting rid of owners and handing over the machinery to the workers. Actually, it's changing fundamentally what you produce, how you produce, and the relationships of production, which will have a knock-on effect equally to the way in which you consume and you distribute or don't. So to give you an example of what's at stake here, or the way that anarchists have sort of called socialism, I've got a quote here from Tolstoy. This is from a book called The Slavery of Our Times. And Tolstoy is a Proudhonist. So Tolstoy is someone who argues that domination is based on 3 institutions: taxation, private property, and law. And he says, you know, if we are to rid ourselves of the enslavements of these institutions, we have to recognise that actually life will change for us fundamentally. Okay, so it's a long quote. I'm just going to pick out this last bit. He says, the supposition that when the socialist ideal is realised, everyone will be free and will at the same time have as much as his disposal everything or almost everything that is now made use of by the well-to-do classes involves an obvious self-contradiction. You cannot expect to change from capitalism to socialism and enjoy everything that capitalism offers you. It's simply a falsehood. And he says again, you know, we have incredible comforts on the basis of the relationship of the state and capitalism. We have electric light, we have telephones, we have exhibitions, we have wonderful culture, and all of that. But he says, if the cost of producing all of this stuff is that 99% of the people should remain in slavery and perish by thousands in factories needed for the production of these articles, the motto for all truly enlightened people is not let culture be preserved though justice perish, it is let justice be done though culture perish. We have to reorder our priorities. Okay, just to finish up, a couple of minutes. One on the commonalities and contradictions. Actually, I don't think these are contradictions, I think they're tensions within anarchism. There are major debates that go on. I mean, I've been talking about sort of historical anarchism, but there are major debates within contemporary anarchism about the way in which we should try and socialise. If we're going to abolish private property, then how should we do that? And there are debates about whether we should recognise rights to a certain extent, whether we should recognise individual contributions, or whether we should just be fully communist. The one I want to concentrate on, though, or draw your attention to, is the debate between those people who call themselves anti-civilizationists and those who have been thought of as modernisers. Okay, now the essential difference between these two groups of people, I think, is the problem that they're trying to solve. Now, for people like Tolstoy and the anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who was a contemporary of his, and who also came out of Russia, and who was very familiar with hardship, rural peasant economies, and subsistence living. One of the things that they wanted to do in proposing, if you like, the complete disruption of all of the networks, the global capital networks that currently existed, one of the things they wanted to do was to think about how you could alleviate the working burdens that the poorest people of the earth faced. And the solutions that they came up with was not to jettison all the technology and tools that existed, but to ethically evaluate what you could use in order to help people improve their own lives, in order to allow people to use these tools for their own benefits. Okay, now the opposite view of that, or the contrary view of that, is what's called the anti-civilization view. And that's the view that says you simply can't abstract technologies from the conditions in which they've emerged. Okay, part of the problem of growth and limitless growth is actually the technological culture in which we live. And so for contemporary anarchists, and I've got people in mind like Uri Gordon here, the idea that we can sort of adapt or cherry pick, if you like, from our existing sort of portfolio of goods is a false one. We actually have to think about, in a very serious way, as Tolstoy recommends, we have to think about demodernising, of rejecting the kind of civilizational cultures that we inhabit. Okay, now I think, although there are significant sort of theoretical differences between these two views, I think largely there is a way in which people come together within the anarchist movement, and it's principally through the idea of reorganising from the bottom up. Hence, you've got the pyramid turned upside down, and in recognising that what anarchism wants to achieve is empowering people to decide for themselves how they want to live in concert with other people, the people in their localities. And what they're proposing in contesting limitless growth is actually a system which is much more autarkic, where we're thinking about what we can produce within the locality and limiting the amount that we have to trade, limiting the amount that we have to transport. What can we do in our localities that might require some technological ingenuity, but fundamentally it requires people who live in these local areas to understand their environments and to be able to understand or to be able to share the knowledge that they have of those environments with people who live outside them. Because that way we build a knowledge bank and we build a relationship with other people who live outside of our regions, which maximizes the ways in which we can support each other and support ourselves in limiting growth, living with nature, not against it, but also in thinking about how we can alleviate for ourselves the desperate burdens that people face in simply scratching a living because of the way in which a small proportion of us on this planet live. And I think now I'm out of time.
That's it or no?
How do you put it down?
No, you have it like that or no?
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how I follow that, but I will attempt to do that. I attended the Degrowth conference in Barcelona and some since that time. George Kallis and I have known each other since I was working on the Water Framework Directive and sent him a student while I was at Cambridge. He helped her deal with that issue, and then much later we came closer around the degrowth issue, and in fact published the piece that we have that argued for a 4-day week in Europe while retaining pay. And by the way, I'm happy to announce that New Zealand now has experimented with this issue, and a firm has adopted the 4-day work week, found that there's greater productivity on the part of workers. The workers are less stressed, doesn't cost them any more, and they're thinking about making it a permanent fixture. So anybody who says 4-day week won't work needs to look at the facts. I thought about growth a lot. One thing that annoyed me about the degrowth question, which doesn't annoy me anymore because it's not so front, is that they said, we're not talking about sustainable development. We're talking about degrowth. Degrowth is not sustainable development. I think that's an incorrect statement. I think sustainable development, which incorporates economic welfare, environmental quality, and earning capacity and meaningful jobs, is totally consonant with the degrowth concept. So it's nice to carve out an area in which you sort of want to make an impact, but I think you're doing yourselves a disfavor by saying it's not sustainable consumption and product, it's not environmental quality, it's degrowth. Well, yes. And I sat down and I said, well, what is it about growth that annoys us? It means different things. First, it means aggregate growth in products and services that consume energy and materials. We're not happy about this from an environmental perspective. You can do something about that. You can de-emphasize GDP. You can de-emphasize productivity. You can decouple physical growth from profit. I'll come back to this. Profit, it's understandable that you would think that the private sector that wants to make more money has to sell more stuff. You can actually arrange it such that the more money is made, the less stuff the private sector sells. That's what we do with water pricing. You know, the more water you use, it doesn't get cheaper per gallon, it gets more expensive. And then when you use too much water, you go back to the first increment and you tax water, so it costs you a lot because you're a hoarder and a pig when it comes to the use of water. So the economic system developed this way, but there's actually no reason why industry cannot make money by providing less. It takes a reconstruction. Now, growth in profits tied to subsidies, tax treatment of investment, profit itself, and the provision of producer and consumer credit is something we're not terribly happy with. And one of the reasons is because there's a lot of money involved. And if you go to the discussion tomorrow night where money is discussed, you'll see, yes, how really important following the money is. You can change the nature of these subsidies. You can have tax incentives or disincentives. You can change the credit practices. You can institute anti-monopoly practices. It doesn't have to be that we need a growth in profits to have a sustainable society. And of course, when you don't have enough domestic consumption, people are going to look to making more money from trade. And when you externalize trade, you've got a whole new marketplace to deal with. But there are problems. And the problems are, for example, if we in a country want to have a carbon tax, but other countries don't have a carbon tax, the provision of refrigerators and cars are going to go and be produced in that country. So you need an international agreement on the issue of a carbon tax and regulation. You can't do it alone. You can't do it alone. And you need to change the border taxation of products that come in that either exploit labor or exploit the environment. There's a growth, and we don't like it, in disparity in consumption, wealth, and income. Unprecedented concentration of wealth. And it's not changing. It's not changing. We could bring the idea of sufficiency in law in. We could tax inheritance. We change the tax structure. We could play around with a guaranteed income, pay for unpaid work. There are all kinds of things that we can do to correct the maldistributions. And there is the growth in under and unemployment, which is very serious. Don't be fooled by a low unemployment rate because people have rejoined the workforce at a fraction of the wage that they formerly had it. So you have to do things like a shorter work week. But let me just say that if you have a shorter work week at the same pay, you're not going to hire any more workers. The idea came from people who were interested in environmental effects. It was not a love of workers. They wanted to shorten the work week. So they said, let's have workers work 4 days a week, so other workers can be hired. That, my friends, is a transfer of wealth from paid workers to workers who were formerly not paid. That's no transfer of wealth from the rich class and from the management class. So you've got to deal with this issue of employment seriously from a technology perspective. While cultural changes, that is demand, is needed, fundamental changes, and this is my message, in law are indispensable to achieving degrowth and growth where it is needed. We need some growth. Some people need to consume more. Some people need to consume less. But you actually can't just take the consumption from the rich and let the poor consume, because you actually are going to end up in more consumption, because the poor spend a much greater percentage of their income on consumption than the rich. These changes include reforms to the financial system, the credit, wealth, and income system, as well as the control of monopoly in products, energy, and the media. And we do not have a competitive economic system. Make no mistake about it. We have an oligopoly, if not a monopoly, in the leading sectors of the society. We need to regulate environmental health and safety, which is not happening now. We need to deal with the economic treatment of investment, profit, and labor, and trade rules as well. How do we do this? Well, I don't think we do it just by attacking the economic system with all of its faults. I think law is an indispensable component of democratic governance. If it is used to foster participation and adequate representation of diverse views and interests, that is, if it's truly representative, and a democratic governance does not mean, as the economic system is moving, that winner takes all. In major sectors, MIT economists have noted that 4 firms dominate most of the leading sectors, and the share of money and profit that went to labor characteristically, which was 50%, is now 33%. Labor is not sharing in the winners take all economy. Law can and should ensure that the least advantages are made relatively better off. This is a Rawlsian concept. It's not a question of making equal slices of pie. It's making sure that those who are really at the bottom have a greater percentage of increase. This takes a social commitment. And wonder if law is used to secure and advance privilege and the concentration of wealth, income, and power, it does not fulfill democratic purposes. May I introduce the term democracy and fairness into the discussion? You have to eliminate negative and positive externalities. Not only are all the factors of production which are used do not carry the freight of the environmental and human damage, but the economy is now so volatile that the last asset that the firms are going to want to add is labor. They'll want to use energy, ICT, artificial intelligence, and the like. Now, my final two comments. One is that analysts like ourselves are fond of saying the following. There are just three questions. Why is the world unsustainable? Secondly, what does a sustainable world look like? And we all can agree on that, actually. And how do you put the carrots and sticks there so that there's punishments and rewards so the system stays sustainable? Well, guess what? There is a missing question. And the missing question is, since this seems so manifestly sensible, the question is, who's standing in the way? Now, many people have said the following at this conference, and they are not correct. We do not need more innovation to solve the energy problem. We do not need to give up on global climate change. We have the technology, it just is not in the hands of the people who are writing the political agenda. The fossil fuel industry is not going to lay over and play dead. We have the technology. There's no innovation deficit. There is simply a political will problem. And my final remarks are that while money is really important, the real currency is energy. The real currency is energy. If you look historically as the rapid rates of growth, it always came because there was cheap energy. Energy is no longer cheap. I mean, forget about the gas prices at the moment. Energy is not cheap, and it's going to get harder and harder to extract calories from a gallon of petrol or whatever. And we do not have to move into total renewables. These are barriers that seem impossible to achieve. We can do it, but what I've not heard here, I've so rarely heard the word law, rules, enforcement, government. Government. There is no other choice. Those of you that believe it's going to happen from the bottom up need to understand that the French Revolution happened once, and the French elite were not looking. They're looking now. You don't think that they will tolerate a second French Revolution, do you? Of course they will not. So we got to be smarter, my friends.
Okay, we have to do this quick, so we're going to take 5 questions, or even more. I would please, I'll try to keep a balance between different speakers. So please, when you ask a question, indicate the speaker you would like to address, all right?
Women first.
Yes, can I see a woman raising her hand? That's what I was looking for, but I didn't see. I saw 7 men doing it. So can I see a woman, please? Yes, there are 2 over there.
Just a question about the government. So how is the government going to solve the problem if the government is standing in the way?
There are a number of answers.
I don't know.
Oh, you want to wait? Okay, sorry, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, we're going to take a few.
This is a question to both Stefania and Andreas. And there's a very clear difference in how you speak and your focus, how broad it is or how narrow it is. And to me, there seems to be a very big contrast between your ideas about knowledge and who should act and in what ways. And I was just wondering if there are kind of any conversations between the two of you on that topic that you would like to share very briefly? Are there any problems with the very sort of strongly sort of the agitation of the way that you're speaking, Andreas? And can that become sort of narrow-minded, even though we're fighting an enemy that it's very valid to fight? Any thoughts on that?
Hello, I have a question for Andreas. You talked about the Rockström proposal of a global agreement, enforceable and very strong. I wasn't sure if you believe this is possible or not. I think it's not gonna happen in the next 3 centuries. And like it has been tried for 25 years, and we see where we are now. And any country that is powerful enough can just get away from any agreement. But I do, like you said, the Ende Gelände type of action and targeting the roots directly is much more efficient, I think.
Can I have a question also for Ruth and Stefania as a priority? For Ruth first. Yes, Inge. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your intervention. I just wonder whether we have the time to do away with capitalism, or whether we somehow have to act within the framework of the system we have. The other thing I'm worried about in this relation is that when we discuss these bottom-up approaches, is this actually possible with the people we have now? When I think about myself and my neighbors and so on, I'm very much doubting that the things you're talking about are realistic. So these are my worries, although I very much like what you say.
And one question for Stefania, more direct to Stefania, because the first one was not directly to her. So, yeah, okay.
I got one question.
So, am I right that Stefania is the first speaker? Okay. Yes. So, I really liked your talk, and it reminded me.
I can't see you.
Here.
Oh, thank you.
It reminded me a lot of the newest report to the Club of Rome, where they also call for actually a new enlightenment, or also a new philosophy for a sustainable world. And my question is, what is your conception of spirituality? Because in this Club of Rome report, they also invoke conceptions of spirituality from Eastern religions, for example, or from indigenous religions. Yeah, and how can spirituality and science somehow be reconciled? It might be a difficult question, but yeah.
Okay, so we start with Nicholas. We can go this way. If you can be quick in your answers, and then I don't know if we have a little bit more time or not for discussion, no?
I just got through talking to a lawyer who succeeded in getting trans fat off the market in the United States. Now that's quite an accomplishment, you know. You've got to be strategic. You can't say, well, I hate capitalism, and we got to defeat capitalism before we do anything. You take one industry at a time. You take the people who are waiting in the wings with the better technology. You make coalitions with those people, and you move the technologies piece by piece by piece. And you have to be strategic, and you have to be organized. But I think it feels good to be ideologic, and it feels good to march together, but that's not where the action is. The action is in the Congress changing, in our case, the House of Representatives, changing in Europe's case, the direction that Europe is going and the direction that the EU is going. I mean, there is a guy named Varoufakis, who's the Greek minister of, ex-minister of finance, who's trying to change the nature of the European Parliament, because that is one of the centers of power that will change what the European Union does. And it's not far-fetched. But if you're not contributing to that effort, then I don't know what you think you're doing from an effectiveness perspective. Because there are real things on the ground that are happening that you can participate in.
Ruth.
Me?
Yeah.
So the question was, can we afford to wait? We got time. And I think it follows quite nicely, actually, from what you've just said, because I don't think there's a, we are where we are. We live in a world which is deeply problematic, and where power relationships are I mean, obviously not working. So what should we do? Do anarchists sit around and say, oh well, there's going to be a French Revolution? No, they're not saying that. They're saying we work in the world that we inhabit. We do what we can. That might mean actually putting pressure on your existing institutions, even if you don't participate in those institutions. You can do quite a lot to put pressure on those institutions by demonstrating, by direct action. So that's one thing you can do. You can change your practices. That's another thing you can do. You can decide not to go to the shopping malls. You can decide to completely change the way in which you consume resources. And if a lot of people do that, that also makes a difference. So I think, the anarchist critique for me is important because, I mean, it makes me, if you like, kind of pessimistic about how far we can achieve anything within our existing frameworks, but that doesn't mean to say that you don't try. It actually gives you every reason to try, but with your eyes open, not thinking that going to the voting booth and putting your X on the piece of paper is going to make the difference. It won't. We know it won't. And when it comes to government and law, I agree. Anarchists are not against rules. They're just for rules that people make, not for laws that are imposed upon them. And that's the difference. So you can struggle to change laws, and it's great when it happens if you can be strategic and change, get something banned or whatever it is. But that's not where it stops. And the anarchist critique, I think, is important because it tells you that that's not where it stops. There's no point at which you can be safe from the monopoly to come back, from that domination. You have to be vigilant, and that means concerted, direct action all the time.
Okay, I will be very brief. Thanks for the first comment, and my answer is no. There hasn't been a conversation between Andreas and myself about this, also because I've just come up with this actually in the last few days with the occasion of this conference. So I hope, because we have been in very good terms so far, so I hope that we still are. And I was invited for supper to his place tonight, so I hope that I'm still invited so we can we talk this through.
Not supper though, drinks.
Yeah. Drinks, sorry. That will help. And about the spirituality, I must confess I had never thought about spirituality before. So while you were speaking, I went blank and I started to think, oh my God, what I'm going to say. But then when you mentioned indigenous knowledge, then yes, this is something that I have been thinking about. I think there is no, as far as I understand, there is no separation between knowledge and spirituality, and so this is very different from Western science, modern science, which has defined itself against spirituality and many other things. So yeah, I think that my proposal for degrowing science and doing some humble science is is exactly this, of learning from other ways of understanding reality, not because one has to replace the others, but because we need a science that is capable of this plurality. And this is not entirely my idea. I have been very much inspired by many others. The latest one I've been reading has been Sandra Harding's, I can't remember the title, but her latest book, she speaks about the plurality of science, of modernity actually, and modern science. So this has been inspirational for me.
All right, yeah. I will have difficulties being brief because there are so many things to discuss here. But I just want to say first that I realize that I run the risk of coming across as narrow-minded in my focus on climate change specifically. But I'm of course happy to intellectually, academically discuss the deep roots of climate change and the domination of nature and how it's bound up with class and gender power and all of these things. And I also realize that politically, at this moment, the struggle against climate change is bound up with a whole range of other struggles, as Naomi Klein, for instance, has consistently emphasized. And here in Europe, in particular, the struggle against climate change is bound up with the anti-fascist front, because what we're seeing in our countries is the rise and rise and rise of parties of the far right that deny climate change at this moment in time, which is so insane that you can hardly get your mind. You can hardly wrap your mind around the fact that this is happening in 2018, and that we'll see the Sweden Democrats, the Swedish fascists who deny climate change, might even become the largest party in the elections that we'll have in 2 weeks. Now, as for the question, well, the planning of the world economy, isn't that impossible? Isn't that just a pie in the sky? Well, I'm not arguing that it is likely that we will solve the problem of climate change. Currently, all the trends are going in the wrong direction. But you don't base your politics on an assessment of probability, the outcome that is most likely. You base your politics on what you think is necessary to solve the problems at hand. And here I will come to my final point, and that is the question of state power and anarchism. I have to say, I'm an old recovered anarchist, so I have a bit of emotional passion here. I consider my politics to be broadly compatible with degrowth, but entirely incompatible with anarchist politics. And I will be so provocative as to declare in favor not only of ecological Marxism, but of ecological Leninism. And I mean that in 3 senses of the term. First, it is the state that is going to make a difference and that is going to reduce emissions, or no one is going to do it. And I entirely agree that the government is here. It will be the crucial agent. I don't see any other possibility than state power pushing in the right direction. Second, we should prepare for war communism in the sense that we will probably have to plan things under emergency conditions. Third, politics of vanguardism, even adventurism, Blanchism, if you will be necessary, because there is no trade union consciousness to rely on when it comes to climate change, meaning that you cannot trust on the spontaneous eruption of popular consciousness about climate change. We have the past decades as evidence of that. We're going to need disciplined vanguards, and I include this kind of conference is also kind of vanguard politics, obviously. We're going to need disciplined vanguards who aim for radical change, including the seizure of state power. And I could go on for a long time. Just allow me to make a couple of more points. If we don't control the state, the enemy does. The Egyptian revolution, in which I was at some point a participant observer, was infused by the anarchist ethos. We're going to change the world without taking power. Look at Egypt today. The enemy is in control of the power of the state, and therefore we have complete disaster in Egypt. Likewise, if you look at the US, The enemy has control over the state, and we're heading towards complete disaster. So it doesn't matter how powerful the climate movement is from below, how much it can stop the Keystone XL pipeline or the North Dakota Access pipeline by direct actions, if the enemy controls state power. So if you want real change, you have to seize the power of the state and turn it against fossil capital. Finally, I just have to say that the local anarchists here are plastering Möllan, I don't know how many of you read Swedish, with stickers that say, "Don't vote, never choose your oppressors." To me, frankly, that is a repugnant message, because it makes a hell of a difference if the fascists of Sverigedemokraterna are sitting in the Swedish parliament who want to repatriate, as they call it, people of foreign origins, including my own partner, for instance, and who deny climate change, or if we have the left party making headway in the elections that want to receive more migrants and to impose radical emissions cuts on the Swedish economy. That kind of anarchist propaganda is, to me, frankly repugnant. Yeah.
Okay. We are 10 minutes. We are 10 minutes over. Katja, we can continue, you think, or it's 10 minutes? Yeah? I mean, I'm asking the organizers. I don't know. It has become a little bit of a discussion of state versus anarchism, which I see that it woke you up. But it was supposed to be a discussion about bringing different knowledges together. So if you can try to bring different things together, it would be nicer than fueling more the division. But we can move it intellectually too now. Yes, please.
Actually, it's a question to you, and it's more like a fun question in a way, because I'm asking myself, why didn't you invite someone in between those two? Because then I can totally go with some. It's just it's not to you, like really not really to you, but you can answer it, sure. Because I can totally agree with some of the stuff you say, and I also think that governments, in a way, are important, but I think there is like something in between those two pretty far away positions, which would be a more maybe democratic socialist idea, where, for example, I think in Great Britain there's a lot of stuff happening at the moment. Corbyn right now is just talking about trains and posts and stuff. I guess it's a good strategy not to want everything from the first moment on, but like, yeah, from time to time, you maybe socialize more aspects of, or democratize more aspects of economy. So I guess there's something in between those two ideas, and it would have been really nice to hear more about that. You talked about it a little bit before.
Thank you for coming over. 2 short questions to all the panelists. What would be your personal proposals first to bring more long-term thinking to politicians? Shall we, for example, reduce their reelectivity? Second, what would be your personal proposals to reduce the influence of vested economic interests on politicians? What could you think about? Thank you.
So something I am longing for, and I think a lot of people are, is the question of, so what do we do now? And it was really, really interesting and great to hear this kind of agitated debate now, because I think the passion is what we need. So to get all this state versus anarchy debate on a more practical path, maybe Ruth, you could give an idea of, if you say you recognize that we have to live within the system that we are now, and the state does have a lot of power. In what way do you think we could still use the power that the state, as it is defined now, has? Use that to get rid of capitalism or prevent climate change or whatever, and then address other issues that the state has? Does that make sense?
Hey.
Thank you very much for organizing this really controversial panel. I think these discussions is what we need. But I have to make a little stance against Leninism here. I just can't avoid it. As you might know by now, I'm from Latin America, and we are coming out of a period where ecological movements to a big share had brought to power so-called progressive governments who were claiming to implement the socialism of the 21st century. The result 10 years later is that we contribute significantly more to climate change. We don't have any social movements anymore because they were dismantled. And socialism and the whole idea of alternative politics is discredited. And it's almost impossible to do anything, and the right is back to power. So, Andreas, I would just like to challenge you what you make of this, and shouldn't we really learn from our experiences?
I have a question mainly to Andreas, but maybe also to the others, and it's in praise of big science. Because we know that we're going to have the next report of the IPCC pretty soon, which will announce that we're going to cross the 1.5 and 2 degree warming threshold. And as Andreas said, it will advocate that we have negative emissions afterwards. Why is it doing this kind of projections? Because every single scenario is based on the assumption of economic growth. Not a single one without. So is that the solution when we have the negative emissions? So look at the publications from the last couple of months in climate science. One says that we have at least half a dozen of tipping points between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And then we cannot go back. If you're beyond the tipping point, there is no way back. A second was from the Resilience Institute saying they analyzed the Earth system. It was never stable at plus 2 degrees, so they expect positive feedback loops to kick in, and when we get at 2 degrees, we're going to end up at 4 degrees. So that means if we do not manage now to stop the emissions in a way that we do not get across 1.5 degrees, there is no way back. So please, Andreas, forget about the negative emissions. That is not a solution. And the question to all of you, this means that we have to have by 2040 about 80 to 90% reduction of CO2 emissions in Europe. Which of your concepts is able to deliver that in the due time? Thank you.
I think I'm going to apologize to the rest of you. I mean, I see many hands and many people have raised their hands before, but I think we will have to leave it here. And I'm going to ask the speakers to very quickly say a few concluding words, trying to answer to the questions or making their final point. Nicholas.
I think we need to remember history. It took a long time for the Third Reich to emerge. The destruction of the parliament and all. The U.S. is not that fragile. We have a legal system, and the Obama power plan is likely to succeed. The banning of chlorophos is likely to happen against the wishes of the president. We don't have a king. There is a legal system which responds maybe slower than we want, but I wouldn't write off the global climate response that people are making. I wouldn't write it off. Any more than in the UK, I would accept the fact that there can never be another referendum. People want another referendum. Just watch and see what happens. Because if enough people are upset in the UK and enough people are upset in the US, we don't have that much control of government as a whole in the hands of one person or one party.
So there were a lot of questions thrown out there. I mean, the last question, which how does my concept help solve climate destruction. It doesn't. You know, you can't ask a political theorist to come up with the answer. It doesn't work like that. All you can ask the political theorist to do is to think about how you might understand the problem that we're in, and then think about the strategies that you might adopt. But can I resolve it? Can the anarchists resolve it? No, of course not. I mean, no one can resolve it in that sense, I don't think. I don't think theory works like that. I just don't think that's what theory does. So the other question, which was, I mean, we kind of moved from strategy to tactics to, you know, to the big plan for having the enlightened vanguard take control of the state and use it for the good. You know, we have no history that tells us that that outcome works. None. All we have is ourselves. That's what I think we have. And we can spread knowledge, we can try and convert people, we can try and persuade people, we can try and put pressure on politicians. Whether or not people choose to vote is entirely up to them. It seems to me that people have to make decisions about what they want to do and how they're going to do it, but not be told by other people what they should do, must do, and will do on pain of punishment. That is not the way to bring about meaningful political change. So no, I don't think anarchism has a silver bullet. I think it has a way of looking at the world, and I think it has a way of looking at power relations, and that if you spend some time thinking about the way in which the anarchist looks at the power relations, then you can act accordingly. You can accept it or you can not, but you can make a different kind of decision about the kind of action you want to take on the basis of the theory that you're given. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, so very briefly on the question of sizing power. So I think that in the end, this is of course a big issue, but I think that in the end it boils down to one question. Do we contemplate violence? Do we accept the idea of using violence to get where we want to get, to size power, to get to the state, blah? Because if the answer is not, then what? I think that what the only thing that we can do is putting our bodies and our minds in the struggle. And our bodies means resisting, opposing, building alternatives, organizing, getting organized. And our minds means thinking of the alternatives, talking to people, also making different kinds of science and knowledge. And second thing I wanted to say on big science, I don't want to become the less popular speaker in the history of academia by saying that I'm advocating for less research funding, okay? That was not my point. Of course, we do need data, and the data I was talking about, I was using in my own speech about the great acceleration and the data we have, that is very important. My critique was on the pretense of creating a big universal science, putting together all forms of knowledge in one comprehensive system, modeling of, because we should accept the idea that we cannot know everything. And we need to politicize science. That's what we need. To have more controversy, to have... Okay, I'm done.
Okay, on the question of voting, is my mic on? Yeah. I don't know who in Sweden is trying to force anyone to vote on the pain of punishment, but I do know of anarchists who are seriously agitating for the view that it doesn't matter if fascists or socialists control the Swedish state. As for Latin America, my understanding is that the pink tide, the left parties that seized power in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Brazil, in Venezuela, banked on high commodity prices as the key resource for redistributing resources to the poorer sections of their populations. And that worked for a time when Chinese growth and a particular kind of expansion of world capitalism early in the century drove commodity prices very high. Once they started to fall and even plunged, as in the oil sector, you got very serious crises for these models of what is clearly not revolutionary socialism, but rather something like social democracy. So, I mean, the shortcomings of the pink tide are more, I would say, on account of the reformism and the limitations of that project than of any kind of you know, Leninist excesses. If you'd like to pick on that, you could find other historical examples, but perhaps not Latin America. Yeah, I'm not an expert in Latin America. I'm just sharing my understanding. Yeah, that's fine. As for the country of Brazil, I think it's quite clear that now that the right has seized state power, you see a total disaster, including on the environmental front with, you know, unrestricted deforestation and things like that, that would not have happened had the PT stayed in power. I hope. It's been getting very significantly worse after the PT lost power. Very significantly worse. Now, I think that the tradition that we need to go back to is the one that has discussed the need for a dialectic between movements from below, mass mobilization, direct action, and state power. So I'm thinking of the whole tradition of oppositional communism from the left opposition, from Kollontai and Rosa Luxemburg up to recent critics in Latin America, for instance, to the left of the governments. This is where we can find inspiration, I think, to deal with the challenges of the present moment, because it's obvious that the states, the governments that we now have, won't do anything on their own accord. It needs massive direct action to push them to do something. On the other hand, direct action itself is insufficient. It doesn't solve the problem only to go out on multiple actions. Now, lastly, on the issue of negative emissions and those things. So I think that a key to reducing the carbon concentration in the atmosphere is to release the land that is currently used for livestock rearing and allow for reforestation and for biomass plantation that can potentially feed Bex plants on an industrial scale. What this requires, I believe, is global mandatory veganism. That is complete termination of consumption of animal products. And I'm not even a vegan myself, so it's not out of culinary preferences that I say this, but I don't see any other solution to how we're going to reduce the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And quite obviously, global mandatory veganism is something that the states will have to impose on their citizens.
There is a paper that was published after the Leipzig conference and were the political views of participants in the Degrowth conference. So it was based on a survey. And they were, I remember, if I remember well, it was by Matthias Smeltzer and Dennis Evertsberg. So they were the eco-socialists, the eco-anarchists, and the pacifists, you know. I think the pacifists are the ones who clapped both, or they didn't clap at all. But the good news is that we keep coming to the conferences and we are still together, so. Okay, thank you all for staying longer.